The burden Mao Zedong assumed was tremendous. His army was pummeled, and they needed to get out of Zunyi fast. Even worse, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the transport of more troops to the west to corner those he called the Red Bandits. Once again, the two armies were on a collision course. After the disastrous battle at the Xiang River, the First Red Army was a shadow of its former self. By January 1935, it lost most of its heavy mortar launchers and nearly two-thirds of its original force of 87,000 men. Meanwhile, the Japanese brushed aside their truce with Chiang Kai-shek and began to expand their territory in northern China. Their next objectives were to the west, the Inner Mongolian province of Chahar and northern Hebei. Chiang monitored these advances, but he was also following the Red Army's advance. Again, he marshaled his men west to block their escape. As the First Red Army pushed on, Mao Zedong reconsidered the ultimate goal of the Long March.
So then the question was where to go. There was 2 or 3 other communist bases in China, in different places, which the Kuomintang had not been able to reach or to assault for various reasons, remote areas, difficult communication, transportation, and so on. So one of these obviously was the place to go for.
Instead of turning back to link up with the Second Red Army, Mao decided instead to try to reach the Fourth Red Army, which had retreated west and was located north of Mao's forces. But the only way to avoid the nationalists in between was to take the least obvious path, to the west. To some, the strategy seemed daring. To others, it appeared reckless. Dozens of rivers and great mountain ranges would need to be crossed to reach the Fourth Red Army in Sichuan province.
They picked the toughest terrain that has never been used by other armies in China. They missed the North China Plain, they missed the Central Plains, they missed the great river systems that would have brought them close to where they were going because they couldn't depend on avoiding the nationalists in those areas. So it was a very, very difficult route.
Since the army was easy to find from the air, Mao and his closest military commander, Zhu De, looked for ways to hide their men.
Zhu De had a strong sense of the ends, the ways, and the means of military strategy. How to move people around the battlefield, how terrain worked, how logistics worked.
The main guerrilla tactic that Mao used during the Long March itself was his dispersing of the marchers into lots of different columns who went on different axes. I mean, they were all going basically to the same place. But they took lots of different routes to get there, and by doing this they deceived the nationalists as to what their eventual target was and rather left the nationalists floundering.
Splitting the Red forces also created command and control problems. The teenaged couriers were recruited from the ranks of the youngest of the Red cadres, the so-called Little Red Devils. Most of them were younger than 15 years old. Just as important as command communication was keeping track of the nationalists. Information on Kuomintang forces was gleaned from stories in local newspapers where censorship was lacking. Local peasants provided tips, and spies played a key role. Using this intelligence and his own instincts, Mao threw the Kuomintang off his trail at the Chushui River. As wide as many spots on the Mississippi, the Chushui had no large boats on it. They had been destroyed earlier by Chiang's troops. Red engineers constructed a crude pontoon bridge out of 6 smaller boats, over which they laid a walkway of planks. Then they spread out all over the countryside in smaller groups. To keep the nationalists off his trail, Mao ordered his men to cross over the Chushui River 3 more times. After consolidating his forces, Mao approached the Loshan Pass. This was a narrow choke point the Reds had to pass through to continue their journey west. Mao sensed this was a site where they were vulnerable. He ordered his men to race to the pass. By now, the nationalists had the same objective, but the Reds moved faster, arriving just minutes ahead of the nationalist troops. On February 26, 1935, the two armies collided head-on.
In this case, Mao had to rely on a very committed front echelon that was able to lay down a base of fire with some automatic weapons and use hand grenades to break through a very narrow area.
Over the two-day battle, Red forces smashed two nationalist divisions, killing some 1,000 troops. Mao won his first significant battlefield victory. Most important, his men began to trust his leadership. The Reds took 2,000 prisoners, captured over 1,000 rifles, and added 100,000 bullets to their arsenal. After nearly 2 months of indirect maneuvers to avoid detection, Mao ordered a feint toward the 4th Red Army. A tributary to the Yangtze River, the Golden Sands River had a single ford at a small toll collection point called Jiaoping Fort. With the rest of the Red Army trailing behind, the Communists reported that a single battalion covered an astonishing 85 miles in a single day and night to seize the fort. This was nearly twice the largest daily advance made by the mechanized blitzkriegs across France during World War II. When they reached the fort, the battalion unpacked captured nationalist uniforms and changed their clothing. In a cunning act of trickery, they talked their way into the fort without firing a shot. When Chiang Kai-shek received the news that Mao had successfully crossed the Golden Sands, he was furious. He immediately flew to Sichuan province, where he personally mobilized new forces, hoping to cut the Red Army off at the next critical choke point, the deep-running Dadu River. Chiang was right. The communist forces had dwindled, but they were gaining new recruits and some support from the Chinese peasants. The Reds carefully exploited this antagonism. Strict rules were enacted to gain support from the peasants, but even policies such as the forcible confiscation and redistribution of the landlord's property were not enough to win over all the poorer peoples of China. The First Red Army was about to confront one of its most hostile adversaries yet, a group of fierce warriors who had never accepted the Chinese in their land. In the early 1930s, much of China was disconnected, with many people who had their own languages and cultures. They often lived far from one another and were cut off from modern conveniences like telephones, highways, and electricity. In April 1935, after nearly 180 days of marching, the Red Army entered the territory of one of these indigenous groups. They were a fierce warrior people called the minority Yi. Their region was known in the West as Lolo Land. An area of dense forests and jagged mountains, Lolo Land remained unconquered and semi-independent of China. Since the minority Yi people were intensely hostile to the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek was betting that if the mountainous terrain didn't stop the Reds, the people living there would. At the very least, the harsh terrain would buy him time to move his forces north of the mighty Dadu River for a final showdown with the communists. To solve these problems, the Reds sent envoys to negotiate with the leaders of the minority Yi. Led by Red Army General Liu Boacheng, who knew the Yi and could speak their language, the Reds made a promise they would keep: to preserve Lolo autonomy if their revolution was successful. With these inducements, the Yi were won over. To seal the bargain, Liu Boacheng and Lolo chieftain Xiao Iadan performed an ancient tribal ceremony. Afterward, many minority Yi joined the Red Army to guide them through the rough terrain and to help them avoid detection by the nationalists. As a result, a small Red Army corps was able to reach the Dadu River. On the other side, Chiang Kai-shek stationed his forces.
everyone expected if they simply protected the proper side of the river, they'd be able to defeat the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek put a lot of people there. And he protected at a point that should have been a good defensive position.
On May 25, 1935, the Reds captured the small town of Anshuncheong. More important, they found a single ferry boat that had not yet been destroyed by the local nationalist forces. Over the next 3 days, an entire Red division was transported across the Dadu. But with the river rising and Chiang's forces closing in, the situation was desperate. One boat was clearly not enough to transport the entire army. Meeting on the banks of the river, Mao and his advisors devised a plan. In what has now become legend, though doubted by some historians, the idea would lead to what the Reds contend was the single most critical battle during the Long March. Mao sent a strong force along a narrow trail that wound through the steep gorge carved by the Dadu River. Across the river, the nationalists quickly realized where the Reds were headed. Soon, both sides were racing toward the same objective. Some 90 miles to the west, there was a small bridge across the Dadu River. Built in 1701, the local inhabitants called it the Looting Bridge. As both armies dashed toward the Looting Bridge, the Reds were harassed by nationalist forces on the opposite bank of the Dadu. Gradually, the vanguard of the Red Army pulled ahead, managing to reach the bridge first on May 29, 1935. About 100 yards long and 9 feet wide, it was a third the length of the Brooklyn Bridge. 13 chains held up the side supports, as well as those for the bridge flooring. While some historians have suggested there was little to no resistance, the communists reported that the bridge was held by a local warlord's regiment. They claimed the defenders had machine guns and mortars, and that much of the wood planking that formed the footway of the bridge had been removed. 13 heavy iron chains were left hanging over the deep, fast-running river. After a firefight, the Reds secured their side of the bridge. Most of them were surprised the chains were not cut on either side by the local warlord. Crossing the Looting Bridge appeared to be a suicide mission. A call went out for volunteers, and 22 men stepped forward. Red machine guns on the opposite bank spattered the defenders' positions with bullets, but they couldn't suppress all of them. The communists claim one of the attackers tossed a perfectly aimed grenade into the machine gun nest guarding the end of the bridge. It was soon followed by a barrage of grenades thrown by other Red soldiers who were following along behind the assault team, replanking the chains as they crossed. In desperation, the defenders set fire to their position, but it was too little, too late. The scope of the battle has been questioned by some historians who contend the story was later embellished. But the fact remains that the First Red Army followed its volunteers across the Dadu. By not cutting the bridge's chain links, Chiang's forces missed a golden opportunity. However, the Long March was far from over. The Reds were heavily outnumbered and still retreating, heading toward the comparative safety of Sichuan province. In fact, the Reds were about to confront their most formidable natural obstacle: the jagged peaks of some of the highest mountains in the world. June 1935. 8 months and over 3,000 miles into the Long March, the Red Army moved into western Sichuan province. With Chiang Kai-shek still trying to decide on his next move, the Reds were safe from the pursuing nationalists, at least for the moment. In the meantime, Japanese newsreels touted the occupation of Manchuria, as the Imperial Army was occupying another northern Chinese province, Johua. Yet patriotism alone could not surmount the awesome natural barrier that lay right in the Red Army's path. It was a series of peaks called the Snowy Mountains, some towering over 15,000 feet. Because of these extreme conditions, the nationalists decided to let nature do their work for them. The Snowies were not a well-defined range, but a series of jagged mountains and high passes in an area of China that was so remote that much of it had not been mapped. Some historians cite Mao's choice to cross the Snowies as an example of blundering, but at this point, he had no other choice to avoid the nationalists. Besides the fact that the Reds were exhausted and decimated by over 240 days of marching, most had no experience climbing or surviving in mountains. Nearly all of them came from the hot and humid semi-tropical areas of southern China, and few had ever seen mountainous snowy terrain, let alone climbed it. Most had no heavy clothing, and put on layers of the light cotton uniforms they had at the beginning of the march instead. Many of them lacked proper boots, and some wore makeshift footwear, stuffed with straw. The high altitude was a constant deadly enemy. The lack of oxygen threatened to transform exhaustion into death. Between peaks, firewood was always in demand to use for cooking. But carrying tree branches far distances was demanding. Daily rations typically consisted of a half pound of rice or sweet potatoes for breakfast, and a similar amount for dinner. The actual quantity was usually far less because of the difficulty in distributing food to a column of troops that stretched over many trails. Some Reds were stricken by snow blindness, a condition caused by the sunlight reflecting intensely off the snow. It produced temporary blindness in its victims. Medical personnel were instructed to march at the rear of the column to care for injured and sick stragglers. Many men chose to slide to get down the mountains, but this was more dangerous than it appeared, and many were lost, catapulting off the cliffs. After climbing over several mountain peaks, the Reds claim they lost nearly 9,000 people. Some of Mao's generals would later write that they had little time to adequately prepare for the snowy mountains. Mao Zedong's tattered First Red Army finally reached the Maogung area of northwest Sichuan province on July 20th, 1935. There it linked up with the Fourth Red Army. The two armies fielded a combined force of nearly 100,000 soldiers. But they could not stay together for long. It was only a matter of time before the nationalists mounted another encirclement campaign. A celebration took place between the two armies, with cordial outward appearances, but just under the surface ran a current of suspicion and bitterness. The Fourth Red Army was commanded by an old rival of Mao, Zhang Guotao. He considered Mao's army to be weak in spirit and in arms. By now, however, Mao re-established radio contact with Moscow. He insisted they continue north toward Shanxi province, an isolated area closer to the border with the friendly Soviet Union. Zhang Guotao was well aware of the dangerous swamplands that had to be crossed, and he strongly disagreed. After several stormy meetings, Zhang finally agreed to follow Mao northward. But the Reds' problems were far from over. Not only was Chiang Kai-shek beginning to consolidate his forces for yet another attempt to corner the Reds, but a new barrier loomed ahead, one that would prove to be the deadliest natural obstacle along the trail. August 21st, 1935. It was the height of summer as Mao Zedong and Zhang Guotao's combined Red Armies entered the Great Grasslands on the border of China's Sichuan province and Tibet. After walking for nearly 300 days, Mao's troops were in the last stages of the long march. There were more direct and easier routes to get to their new objective in Shanxi province, but they would have taken the Reds through areas strongly held by the enemy. Once again, fearing the nationalists were closing in, Mao left little time for his generals to prepare. Upon hearing that an army was coming, the local nomads abandoned their villages, taking all their food and cattle with them. Even worse than the food supply was the weather. Constant rain turned the ground into an immense swamp. It was a deadly trap. Beneath the flowers that covered the grasslands lurked bogs that could swallow men and animals. Even in August, the temperatures hovered just above freezing, and food became even more scarce. To ensure there were enough provisions for everyone, the army rationed what it had. For some, the penalty for breaking the rule was severe.